We're back in the lab, and this time I want to talk about the later part of the evolution of Homo erectus. You've already seen the earlier part, as Homo erectus originates, and early evidence of that species occurs in the Republic of Georgia outside of Africa, and also in East Africa and South Africa. The later evolution of Homo erectus is documented in Africa, but we have larger fossil samples from East Asia and extreme Southeast Asia, from the island of Java. These are places where the early evidence for human evolution began to emerge during the 1890s. They're among the earliest sources of evidence that we had about our evolution. But as we now know, they occur relatively late in the timeline of our evolution. So the fossils that I'm going to talk about today occur between the time period of around 1.4 million years ago up to about 500,000 years ago, or maybe slightly more recently. I'll talk a little bit about the complexity of figuring out exactly when these fossils were deposited. In the later part of Homo erectus, we have some contrasts anatomically with humans, contrast with apes, and contrast with earlier hominids. And so just to give a little bit of impression, this is a skull from the latest part of Homo erectus. It might have occurred within the last 500,000 years. It's certainly less than about 600,000 years ago, and this is from a site called Ngandong in Java. This skull, compared to a human skull, exhibits a number of differences. When we look at a human skull, we see a much more rounded forehead, a higher arching shape to the cranial profile, and a skull that, if we look at it from behind, will have a maximum width much higher on the skull. This Homo erectus skull is different from that in several ways. We see this Homo erectus skull is most wide at its base, very near the bottom of the skull. We also see, when we look at its profile from the side, that this skull has a slanting forehead that goes relatively backward and not upward as it arches above the eye orbits. Now this skull, like many skulls of Homo erectus, lacks a face. And we have to think about how to orient it properly. I have a reconstruction of a skull from slightly later in time. This skull is from China. It's around about 500,000 years old, and it's a reconstruction that puts together this part of the brain case, or cranial vault, with a reconstruction of the face. And you can see what the orientation of these two things relative to each other should be. Now, we talked about early Homo erectus. How are these skulls different from what came earlier in time? To answer that question, we can look at one of the earlier crania, this one from Dmanisi in the Republic of Georgia, and you get some impressions that the overall shape of this skull is very similar. It's a skull that has a brow ridge that protrudes in front of the brain case. It has a slanting profile of the frontal bone, here at the beginning, the front of the skull. It's relatively long compared to its height. It's a short skull, it's a long skull compared to that height. And the maximum width of this skull is right here at the bottom of it. It's close to the base of the skull. It's not high up on the skull, as it would be in a modern human skull. Later examples of Homo erectus are similar to that. Even this skull from Nandong, this is Nandong 11, which is much larger than the earlier skull of Homo erectus from Dmanisi, this skull still shares those fundamental aspects of shape. It has a brow ridge that protrudes in front of the brain case. It has a slanting frontal profile. It has an angulation at the back of the skull with a distinct torus, this bar of bone that sticks back behind it. And its maximum width is near the base. It's a long skull relative to its height. Those aspects are how we define Homo erectus. The reason why we talk about Homo erectus as a species is because the skulls share these basic characteristics, both earlier in the timeline and at the end of the timeline. We recognize them by those features. However, later in time, we do see a number of changes. The most prominent of those changes is in the size of the skull. This skull has an endocranial volume, the volume inside of the brain case, of more than 1,100 cubic centimeters. The earlier skull of Homo erectus, the very early part of the timeline at Dmanisi, have brain sizes that vary between about 550 and about 750 to 800 cubic centimeters. So we're looking at an expansion in the size of the brain by almost 50% in some of these later Homo erectus specimens. That change across the timeline of Homo erectus is very consistent. The later skulls from China, the later skulls from Java, and the last skulls that we call Homo erectus in Africa, which date to around 1 million years ago, those skulls all have larger brains than the earliest examples of Homo erectus. So we have very clear evidence of directional evolution in this species over time. Homo erectus is known to us initially because it was discovered in Java. And the first skull of Homo erectus to have been found is this one. This is from a site called Trinil. And it was found by Eugen Dubois, who was a Dutch physician, doctor really, who was interested in exploring the missing link, finding the evidence of human ancestors. Because he was Dutch, because Holland was part of the German-speaking world, he was really influenced by the ideas of Ernst Haeckel. Haeckel was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, and Haeckel thought a lot about evolution, in particular thought about human evolution. Haeckel believed that the evidence for human evolution might be found in Asia, in Southeast Asia in particular. And so Dubois got himself stationed as a colonial doctor in Java to try to use his spare time to find evidence of human origins. This is the skull that he succeeded in finding in 1891. Now, as you can see, this skull has many of the features that we saw of Homo erectus. It has a brow ridge that protrudes in front of the skull. It has a low cranial profile. It's relatively long compared to a low height, and the maximum width of the skull is near the base. In addition, when we look at this skull, although it's relatively small compared to some of the examples that existed at the same time, it strikes us immediately as being more robust than humans are today. And those things were things that Dubois noticed. In the same site as this skull, Dubois found a femur. And this femur, like the femora that we've seen of earlier hominins, shares a very basic human characteristic. The base of the femur is angled relative to the shaft of the femur. That valgus angle could be interpreted no other way as a similarity to humans today who walk upright. It's for that reason that Dubois named his species Pithecanthropus, that's ape man, erectus, erectus meaning standing upright. Now, after Dubois did this work, the early 1890s, people came to a different idea about the chronology in this site. Today, most of us don't believe that this femur is associated with the skull, although in Dubois' time they did. Nevertheless, all of the evidence that we have of Homo erectus postcrania is evidence that's fully in line with the idea that they were upright walking like humans are, and in fact, much more human-like in their anatomy than any of the earlier hominids. What's different about Homo erectus compared to humans is mostly in the skull. The postcrania exhibit some slight differences, but for the most part are basically like human postcrania today, and that includes body size. One of the most fascinating aspects of Homo erectus in the later part of its evolution is that different parts of the species begin to evolve in ways that are recognizably regional. And we can look at that when we look at the differences between the skulls that we have here from Java compared to the skulls that we have here from China. We'll give a quick outline of the differences that occur in Homo erectus after 1 million years ago in these two different parts of the world. This skull from Nandong shares many characteristics with other Javan Homo erectus crania. And in particular, if we look at the skull from the front, we'll notice that the brow ridge is very horizontal. It's a brow ridge that goes right across the face from side to side. It doesn't arch up noticeably above the eye orbits, and directly above that brow ridge is a fairly flat surface. In fact, if we look at the skull from the side, we'll discover that that flat surface forms a fairly continuous profile with the end of the brow ridge. That characteristic, along with the pronounced areas of muscle attachment at the back of the skull, the very strong angular torus, the strong nuchal torus, and the pronounced areas of muscle attachment for the neck muscles, those are characteristics that really stand out in the Javan sample of Homo erectus from the earliest part of its evolution, more than 1 million years ago, up until the latest part of its evolutionary history, documented here maybe less than 500,000 years ago. By contrast, this is a skull from Zhoukou in China. And this skull, it's about 500,000 years old, maybe a little older. It has supraorbital tori, this brow ridge, arches right over both of its orbits. Above the brow ridge, it has a distinct groove. This is called a sulcus. And if we look at the profile of the skull, above that sulcus, there's a little bit of a bulbous nature, sort of bulge here to the frontal bone. That morphology is shared by most of the Chinese crania. If we look at the back of the skull, we'll see that there's still a distinct nuchal torus projecting from the back of it, but overall the robusticity of this skull is less. Those characteristics mark the Chinese fossil sample, whereas other characteristics mark the Javan fossil sample. These are subtle changes. They're not huge differences. They're parallel in many ways to the subtle differences that a forensic anthropologist would notice between human populations now. Humans today are not different species, but we do have slightly different characteristics in different populations. Those overlap a lot between populations, but a clever anthropologist can look at them and get clues about where a skull is from. And that seems to have been true at this stage in the past. When we look at the differences that occur between the Javan representatives of Homo erectus and the Chinese representatives, those kind of differences, they're fairly subtle. Yet they reflect the evolution of these different populations of Homo erectus in these different parts of the world. That diversification, which emerges as humans initially leave Africa and then becomes established in different populations, that kind of diversification is something that we see when we look at the genetics of later humans. The big idea about the later evolution of Homo erectus is that even at the same time that these populations are evolving in a concerted way toward larger brains, they are nevertheless establishing regional differentiation. And that regional differentiation is a pattern that we see both earlier and later in human evolution. When we're looking at the evolutionary trajectory of this population as a whole, we're looking at a trajectory that involves change over time and diversification among regions. We will see later in human evolution the way that Neanderthals represent another kind of diversification, the way that African populations are becoming more diverse. The mechanisms by which that evolution is happening are probably very similar to mechanisms to what we can see in this earlier phase of human evolution. And so studying the way that these Homo erectus populations were diversifying is going to give us a lot of insights about where our present genetic variation may have come from.